Hello everyone, welcome to Diplomatic Briefing. On August 29th, the Brazilian data analysis company released its latest poll, showing that Brazilians recognize China's international leadership more than that of the United States. Most Brazilians believe that America's leadership position has a negative impact on Brazil, while China's influence is seen as more positive. The survey results show that when asked about the impact of the leadership of China and the United States in global political and economic spheres on Brazil, 56% of Brazilians have a negative view of American leadership, with only 32% holding a positive view. As for China, 47% of Brazilians see its leadership as positive, while 39% view it negatively. In addition, regarding Brazilians' impressions of the two countries, 46% of respondents have a view of the United States, have a positive impression, while 43% hold a negative view. Meanwhile, 45% of the public have a positive opinion of China, and 43% have a negative opinion. Netflix CEO Tokarski commented that these figures are striking. Historically, the image of the United States in the minds of Brazilians has always been better than that of China. Now, the two countries are rated similarly, which indicates that America's image has declined and some of its appeal has been replaced by China. Another research institute, Quaest, conducted a poll showing that 48% of Brazilians have a negative view of the United States, which is double the 24% at the beginning of 2024. At the same time, 44% of respondents have a positive view of the United States. As for China, the trend is the opposite. 37% hold a negative view, while 49% have a positive impression, which is higher than last year's 38%. Among the group that supports the current President Lula and is committed to building closer ties with Beijing, nearly 70% have a negative view of the United States, while 60% have a positive view of China. As for the results of the Netflix survey, Arthur, the editor-in-chief of Brazil 247 News, wrote an article pointing out that this shift in perception is a direct result of the radical approach of US President Trump. He said, ironically, Trump has actually become the biggest promoter of a multipolar world. Arthur mentioned that for decades, the United States built its global hegemony not only by relying on military and economic power, but also on soft power, using cultural influence as a symbol of freedom, ideals, and prosperity, as well as promoting freedom and democracy to attract and inspire other countries. This is exactly why the American way of life was long seen as a model for the world to pursue throughout the 20th century. However, Trump managed to weaken this symbol in a very short period of time by turning allies into adversaries, attacking multilateral institutions, and even adopting confrontational diplomacy when dealing with traditional partners. He is eroding America's image as a so-called reliable power. Now, the United States is no longer seen as a defender of democracy and free trade, but rather as a capricious, belligerent, and increasingly isolated country. He said that, in hindsight, this was almost predictable, that at the moment of imperial decline, it was precisely an American president who brought this about. He made the greatest contribution to the decline of the empire. Trump did not consolidate American hegemony. Instead, he exposed its limitations and revealed its arrogance. By attacking Brazil, the EU, Germany, Canada, and Mexico, and by putting pressure on Latin America and launching a trade war with China, he made the world realize that humanity can no longer rely on a single center of power. As a result, even countries that have traditionally depended on Washington have started to look for new options, such as in Brazil. Surveys show that more and more people believe China can play a more active role than the United States in national development. This is a direct reflection of Trump's disastrous foreign policy. According to Arthur, it is ironic that Trump's nationalist and unilateralist rhetoric has inadvertently fueled public debate in Brazil, making society more aware of the importance of sovereignty and the necessity of a multipolar world. In such a world, emerging countries like Brazil will have their interests respected and will no longer be forced to submit to a superpower that no longer hides its contempt. Arthur points out that although Trump originally used "Make America Great Again" as his campaign slogan, his historical legacy may be exactly the opposite, driving multipolarity and eroding American hegemony. As the US loses allies and creates more enemies, it is becoming an empire in decline, while at the same time opening up space for Brazil and other countries to assert their sovereignty in the New World Order. It's not just Brazil that has changed its attitude toward the United States. A survey released by its research center in July shows that people in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina have a more positive view of China. Although the United States is still most frequently mentioned as an important economic ally, 56% of Mexicans and 51% of Brazilians have a positive view of China. Argentinians, however, are more divided, with 42% holding a favorable opinion of China. Among these three countries, although the US still is seen as the main partner, it is also most often regarded as a threat. This reflects how Trump's trade policies are causing tensions in Latin America. The Pew Research Center's study also found that people's perceptions of the global power structure are changing. In Brazil and Argentina, more and more people believe that China has already become the world's leading economic power. As a Brazilian media personality analysis pointed out, the conclusion is that Americans elected Trump as president with the intention of making America great again. Ironically, he has made the United States less popular, and its hard power will weaken as its soft power fades. On the other hand, Americans themselves are also showing increasing lack of confidence. Recently, space policy writer Martin wrote an opinion piece for the U.S. Congress 3 reports, discussing the U.S.-China competition in lunar exploration. He mentioned another article recently published by technology media journalist Parker, saying that this article has caused a stir within the aerospace policy community. Parker pointed out that China has successfully tested lunar landing-related hardware multiple times, including a prototype of a crewed lunar lander and also in space. After a series of previous setbacks, a sobering conclusion was reached. Right now, it is very possible that China will beat NASA in returning to the moon within the next 10 years, and at the very least, win the initial stage of this new space race. Whittington believes that perhaps Parker is conceding defeat too early, but he says this does serve as a wake-up call. At some point in the future, the public may gather in front of their televisions, watching as, for the first time since December 1972, the first people to set foot on the moon are speaking Chinese. Whittington also warns that if China really does send humans to the moon before NASA, it will be a huge embarrassment for the United States. Americans will start blaming each other everywhere, and debates over who lost the space race will inevitably follow. Or perhaps everyone is responsible. He believes that mistakes made by politicians from both parties in the US, as well as the business sector, have collectively led to failure in the second lunar race. These mistakes can be traced back decades, including 2 failed attempts to launch deep space exploration programs, an excessive obsession with space-related political gains rather than rational technological development, and over-regulation of commercial space launches. However, after making these comparisons, it seems very likely that the US will experience delays. The plan to return to the moon in 2026 may be delayed, but Whittington also downplays the significance of China's lunar landing. He claims that if China simply replicates the Apollo program with a flag planting and footprint mission, its long-term significance will be limited. If NASA and its partners continue to advance, using the Orion spacecraft and then relying on Blue Origin's lunar lander to establish a nuclear-powered lunar base, then China's victory may be nothing more than a fleeting moment. In the end, the winner of the new lunar race may not be who returns to Earth first, but rather who is the first to establish a permanent base. On August 4th, Politico reported that US Secretary of Transportation and acting NASA Administrator Duffy plan to announce an accelerated push to build a nuclear reactor on the moon. The report mentioned China multiple times and revealed that NASA is looking for companies capable of sending a reactor into space before 2030, because that is exactly when China plans to send its first astronaut to the moon. Then, on August 6th, the New York Times published an article saying, Many aerospace and nuclear physics experts believe that the timeline proposed by NASA is unrealistic. The United States is unlikely to complete the design, construction, and regulatory approval of a lunar nuclear reactor before 2030. American experts also pointed out that NASA may want to use the nuclear reactor to power a lunar outpost, but currently the US has not provided any similar lunar plans, which is rather absurd. The United States is constantly hyping up the so-called China space threat topic. Previously, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning responded by saying that China has no intention of engaging in a space race with any country, nor does it seek so-called space superiority. The US has openly defined outer space as a combat domain, continuously expanding its military presence in space, forming space military alliances, and promoting the militarization of outer space, which seriously threatens the common security and development interests of all countries in outer space. China urges the US to stop spreading irresponsible remarks and to cease military confrontation in outer space in order to truly safeguard lasting peace and security in space. In recent years, China's lunar exploration program has made smooth progress, and the development of manned lunar landings is advancing steadily. Multiple lunar orbiting and sampling missions have already been carried out, laying the foundation for achieving the first Chinese manned moon landing before 2030. To sum up simply, first, every research and development project in the US nowadays is tied to China as an imaginary adversary. Without China, the US would lack the resources to carry out certain development projects. This is a case of politics taking the lead, which disrupts America's true scientific pursuits. Second, the US is increasingly showing a lack of confidence. In fact, for the US to return to the moon and establish a base, it requires long-term planning, not just politicians making impulsive decisions. Third, by comparison, China is taking a steady and solid approach in every step. Every step is carried out methodically. First, they explore the feasibility of building a lunar scientific research station. Then, they spend a year on preliminary key technology research, public relations, and in-depth analysis. Currently, they have fully entered the prototype development stage, so China's lunar landing is definitely not, as some American experts claim, just about leaving footprints. It was only after repeated demonstrations that it was confirmed a base could be established, and after thoroughly discussing the purpose of building the base, that the lunar landing program was initiated.